The only thing that traumatised me was the idea that it would not be seen. Because what I do know about the power of theatre, more so than a news bulletin, these things live. Storytelling is the birth of consciousness. We have to hang on to this.
This is Writer's Mosaic in Conversation, and I'm Colin Grant. Here I'm talking with the playwright Juliet Gilkes Romero, focusing on her play The Whip. But we began by recalling our time together. We first met at the BBC as journalists more than 30 years ago. I joined the BBC as a trainee in 1989. When did you join?
I joined in 87, actually. I was a local radio news producer and reporter, and they had a scheme, a regional scheme for journalists entering news and current affairs. So I chose assignments in all of the northern stations, actually. So I started off at BBC Radio Merseyside. I worked at BBC Radio Sheffield, worked my way to Newcastle, Lincoln, BBC Radio Leeds. I actually interviewed Jimmy Savile in his condo.
What was that like?
Leeds. I just remember a lot of white fur. And I sat on a white fur rug, and he was in silk pants. He was literally sitting there with his knees akimbo.
Oh, God.
Holding court, medallions everywhere.
Wow.
I know. And I look back on that. And then when I was at BBC Radio Sheffield, I was there for Hillsborough.
Oh.
And I was a trainee at the time.
Remind people who are not from this country what Hillsborough was.
So Hillsborough was the football catastrophe. It was a final being played between Liverpool and Sheffield. And I think there were over 90 deaths in a crush in the stadium. And the day before, I'd interviewed, it was Chief Inspector Duckenfield for a local radio news piece about his arrangements for match security. And I remember him being quite tall. He really gave me the time of day. I was a trainee, and he explained how he was going to manage his security. And I never forget, after the interview, he said to me, if I ever considered a career in the police force, that I should come and see him.
Wow.
He was all about diversity, actually. I was really impressed with him. The second morning, the morning of the match, I was setting back to see my parents who lived in Suffolk, driving across country, and I was listening to the radio, and I turned back as a news story broke. And certainly in terms of his career, how the mighty have fallen, events. I have to say that I really felt for him. I think that he felt that he had a plan, and everything fell apart. I also grieve for the communities, particularly, the Liverpool community, because I have a lot of relatives from Liverpool, and really understood their pain. And also because of the newspaper headlines, particularly The Sun, and the way that they weaponised what happened to the fans and blamed the fans. But I could honestly say that as a young trainee reporter, it really challenged my mental health at the time. We were all deeply affected by what happened. And also by the fact that we were trying to manage a story before 24-hour news. And I remember network radio, sports correspondents arriving and literally taking the story from our hands, which felt very challenging. But that was my first introduction to true rolling news, actually.
So when we met, we were both in the newsroom.
Yeah.
And at that time, in the late 80s, early 90s, had you already started to write for yourself?
I had been writing since childhood. And my earliest recollection, I wrote a musical version of Alice Through the Looking Glass, which my parents kept in their attic long after I'd forgotten about it. So I'd always kind of dabbled with a bit of poetry, short stories. I knew that I was fascinated by film. I really wanted to write film and be a film director, but actually never managed to write a full screenplay. So I think what led me to take myself seriously as a writer was the exhaustion of 24-hour news. I decided that I needed to nurture myself as a creative. At the time, I was working as a producer on BBC Breakfast for News 24, working 12-hour shifts, 3 days on, 3 days off. So you started at 10 in the evening, you finished at 10 in the morning. And I can remember leaving shifts, arriving home, and there'd be like scratches and bumps all over my car, and not remembering how these happened. So the first morning, your first morning off, you finish at 10 a.m. and you're comatose. The second day, you're literally picking your underwear off of the floor, and going to your local supermarket. And then the next day, you have to be in that evening. It was a ridiculous turnaround. And while I learned a lot about 24-hour news and how reactionary news had become, and for me, quite dumbed down, I sent examples of my work to screenwriting courses and the Goldsmiths MA in writing for performances. And because I hadn't managed to complete a screenplay, I was rejected from the screenwriting courses and ended up at Goldsmith. But I think that was a fantastic thing that happened, because it was a theatre studies course, and the focus was on the crucible of live theatrical production. And boy, did I learn to write, because on stage you cannot hide. If the writing is not good, an audience will see and feel that. But also being in a rehearsal room with a director and actors who are test driving your work is an extraordinary experience. And hearing your work on its feet for the first time, is almost like a spiritual experience, because it's so holistic and you're in there with real people. It's really organic. The first play that I wrote was At the Gates of Gaza, which I wrote for my MA. And the first draft I wrote, I was told it read like a panorama documentary. I had a lot to learn.
So just to posit and to locate this play, it's the end of the First World War. It's the Black West Indian Regiment.
Yes. So basically it was about the regiment as they were recruited, fighting in what was Palestine during 1917. And it was Marcus Garvey who urged the British government and the royal family at the time to give these men an opportunity to fight for democracy and equality. He was spurned, but then after the first couple of months, as people were dying, that they realised that actually that this is a global endeavour, and that they needed troops from Africa, from Asia, and from the Caribbean. And the British West Indies Regiment was raised. Some men had already stowed away to London and ended up on the Western Front, but the BWI were raised to fight the Turkish in Palestine. And they were mainly asked to fight the Turkish because even then it was unconscionable for an armed black man to kill a white man even though he was the enemy. These were the kinds of debates that were flying across government at the time of the war. So you had these two military forces who were not considered European, kind of put to fight each other.
Yes, and then towards the end of the war, there were black soldiers who weren't even given arms. They were given mops and brushes instead.
Yes.
And that created problems for them.
It did, because there were men who won medals of distinction for fighting in Palestine under George Allenby, you'll find dispatches where they are lauded for their bravery, but when there was victory, and German prisoners of war were taken to camps at Taranto in Italy, these same men were then their weapons were taken away and they were made to clean the latrines of the German soldiers, and their salaries reduced. And unfortunately, they ended up mutinying because they had sacrificed so much for equality, for democracy. But when that last bullet was fired, their sacrifice and contribution was not recognised. And the other because I spent a lot of time at the Imperial War Museum researching the BWI, they were scarcely photographed. So the British public back home had no understanding of the diversity of the troops fighting for freedom and equality during the First World War. So those who were demobilised in Britain were really unknown to the British public, and they were not allowed to march in the Victory Parade. The Sikhs were allowed to march in the Victory Parade, but that honour was not afforded to British West Indies troops.
And is this story very particular to you? Why is it so important to you?
So, number one, because of the conversations that I had with my parents about the black veterans that they remembered, the older guys talking about their experiences.
Where would your parents have been at that time?
So this was, my mum's from Trinidad and my dad's from Barbados. And they told me that it was those veterans who could make their way back. So the first Prime Minister of Jamaica, Michael Manley, fought in that regiment.
Norman Manley.
Yeah, Norman Manley, thank you. And they were the ones who created the first trade unions and political groups right across the Caribbean. So these were revolutionary men, dangerous men. They went to change the reality for Caribbean people. But I wrote it from a perspective of anger, in all honesty. I was a senior producer at BBC World Service TV, BBC World, and presenters were not allowed to wear poppies. The explanation given was that an overseas audience, mainly in Africa and the Caribbean, wouldn't understand the significance of a poppy. And I had a stand-up row with a line manager trying to explain to him that there were cenotaphs throughout the and Africa. And to this day, presenters for BBC World do not wear poppies because of this belief or this policy that the poppies signify a stream of British history that may not be relevant or understood to an overseas audience.
That's very crass.
I mean, it made me so angry because this line manager knew about Anzacs. He knew about the Australians. He knew about the New Zealanders who particularly fought at Gallipoli, but had no knowledge of the British West Indies Regiment or African regiments which were raised. I was incensed. So I wrote At the Gates of Gaza. And being a journalist like yourself, the research, because I knew that, when you are challenging and resurrecting the past, you better make sure that your facts are right. So I would go to the Imperial War Museum. They were brilliant. They took me through all the archives. They gave me my own desk. I was reading diaries from men who died in what was Palestine. And what was particularly interesting was the thirst and just the fight with the heat and how biblical the history of the territory. Samson's Ridge was within sight. So with the play, I used the kind of blindness of Samson, who was blindly loyal to the people and his society, and how British West Indies Regiment, why were these men fighting? What were they fighting for? And the fact that they found themselves in an environment and begun to question themselves. I did also have a lot of fun.
So just to go back with the blindness,
Yeah.
So there's an outbreak of blindness amongst the troops.
No, it was a metaphor
Right.
for Eyeless in Gaza by Milton, talking about Samson's blindness to what was happening to him, how he was being used, and how the British West Indies Regiment were ultimately used and not appreciated, and their sacrifice not recognised when it came to victory and armistice. So much so that by the June of 1919 there were race riots in the UK, and these black veterans, demobilised, were being attacked in the streets. But it was also mirrored in America, where black veterans who were returning with a lot of confidence, because this is what they'd been fighting for, equality. But, you know, again, the American population were not appraised of their heroism. I always have a word with heroism. I'm not quite sure what a hero really means. But, you know, so every year when we remember, we have Armistice Day, I know that there are a lot of young black people, particularly young black men, who do not feel that they have a right to British history, who feel disenfranchised, and they shouldn't.
It's interesting you mentioned Marcus Garvey, who I know a little bit about. So yes, he was a big campaigner for the fact that black people in the colonies should be allowed to wear arms and fight, because they were just as capable of defending and fighting with honour as any white person. But years later, when Woodrow Wilson brought America into the First World War to make the world safe for democracy, by then Marcus Garvey was in America, in Harlem, in New York, and would stand on soapboxes and say to people, it's okay for Woodrow Wilson to say that we're going to make the world safe for democracy. How about making Georgia safe for the black man first?
Yeah.
And he worried that after the war, when black people and white people in America and elsewhere put their differences to one side, the old order would be reasserted.
And that's exactly what happened after both campaigns, First World War and Second World War. You know, and this is why I wrote At the Gates of Gaza. It's like, we know what that cycle is.
We're going to send people to buy the scripts. The scripts are available
Yes.
of At the Gates of Gaza. But what is the denouement of the play?
So it's bookended by the riots
Right.
of 1919. It begins with, so the story is of a mixed race Scouse lad whose father is from the Caribbean, who doesn't really understand his history, and he wants to fight with a white regiment on the Western Front, but he's sent to join the British West Indies Regiment, and it's about him trying to find his place amongst men that he doesn't understand. A West Indian culture that he has to learn in order to survive, and about those men learning about this young mixed-raced man and the challenges that he faces. Our history always goes up in flames. That memory is always erased. So I bookended it with this young man defending a hostel for military veterans in Liverpool, because these hostels and boarding houses were burnt to the ground. So the history goes up in a puff of smoke, but it ends with him defending this hostel in flames.
So that's 1919. I'm going to take you back to 1833 now for your play The Whip. What was the spark? I mean, I think I might know what the spark is, but let me hear what you say. What was the spark for your interest in writing this play?
So I've always been interested in the morality of debt. What is it? And how it's used to oppress us. I then saw a tweet by HMRC congratulating us as British citizens for, you know, the fact that our tax money had paid off a compensation loan that was raised to pay off slave owners, and that this loan was so big it was finally paid off in 2015.
So this is a compensation that was going to be delivered to slave owners in 1833.
Yeah, to persuade them to give up their slaves.
Their enslaved people.
That's right. So HMRC put out this apparently innocuous but self-congratulatory tweet about, our contribution to this. And there was a huge backlash because people didn't know about it. When I saw it, I thought...
Did you know about it?
No. And I do like to write from a position of ignorance, actually, because I think that's the best journey. Because if I don't know I can take my audience on a journey of discovery as well. And it was the same with At the Gates of Gaza. I didn't know about the British West Indies regiment fighting during the First World War. So I thought, oh my goodness, everyone's going to be wanting to write about this. This is extraordinary. I then attended a day of provocation run by the Royal Shakespeare Company. And I talked about this. So I was challenged to write a treatment. So they have 3 stages. One is the other place, more like a studio. And they were wanting to commission writers for that space. And I wrote this treatment A4, talking about 1833, this compensation bill, because I applied to the Information Act, because I needed to see this for myself. So I was then delivered the evidence of this compensation fund that was 40% of the country's GDP in 1833.
Huge amount of money.
A huge amount of money. So the debt that the British public then suffered as a result of this. So I handed it in and they read the treatment, and I'll never forget what the literary manager, Pippa Hill, said. She read it and she said, "You and I both know that this is not going to fit into the other plays. This is a straight commission for the Swan stage," which was overwhelming. Because I've always, I've been told I have a big pen. I try to make things, it's like going from the macro to the micro. You've got to locate stories in character. It's not just about research or telling history. So they're big ideas, but with really strong localised characters. And the RSC gave me a platform, a wonderful platform, to tell a story that they didn't know about. Because in what history book, when I did history, I just remember that kind of black and white print of slaves packed into this hull of a slave ship, and that was it. I didn't know that there were slaves or runaway slaves in this country. Mary Prince was the first black woman to petition Parliament about slavery. I recreated her in The Whip as Mercy Price, because in effect she died just before abolition. But to get those voices of the black activists here who were intersecting with that abolition bill. The play, before it opened, was slightly written off by reviewers who were saying that this is going to be the RSC's new season, and there's a slave play by Juliet Gilkes Romero called The Whip. And I was very frustrated by that, because it's not a slave play. I chose 1833 because in that year you had abolition going through, which the Whip had to fight to pass and get past slave-owning MPs. We had the Factory Act, MPs who owned cotton mills, and the fight to reduce the hours of children. Children could be working 14 to 16 hours. Many were dying in abject poverty and in dreadful circumstances where they would be crushed, or I read accounts of children being kicked to death by owners. I mean, terrible things that were profoundly upsetting. And I went to the cotton mills to learn that history and read those accounts, so that I was really invested in British history. It also intersected with the Reform Act, working class men fighting for the right to vote. So you had riots in Bristol, and famously, I think it was the mayor of Bristol was hung out of his residence by the ankles by furious working class men during this battle for their right to vote. There was also Catholic emancipation, but the play was expanding so far I had to cut back on all of that. This is a play about British history, and I'm telling people what they don't know about themselves.
Now, it's interesting you should say The Whip. someone coming to the play without knowing the context,
Yeah.
they might think the whip refers to the slave whip.
Yeah, absolutely.
But in this play, the whip is the chief whip.
Yeah.
Can you explain the role of the chief whip?
So it was the chief whip's job to bully recalcitrant MPs into voting for this bill, the compensation bill, to bring about the end of slavery in the British colonies. And it was a task because he was having to fight with slave-owning MPs who understandably, and I really did enjoy this part because I'm not into agitprop. I really believe you have to understand all of your characters. I had to write characters who were fighting to continue the institution of slavery. And I had a particular character, Hyde Villiers, who owned slaves, who pointed out that all of Britain's rivals were hanging on to the industry of the transatlantic slave trade. You know, America, the Dutch, you know, where would that leave Britain and its economy? For me, the allegory was also Brexit. We were at a cliff and we didn't know what was on the other side. The same concept went to Congress in America, but they couldn't agree, and it ended with the American Civil War. So, I mean, not that I think that there would have been civil war in the UK, but what those politicians were also alive to was the slave uprisings in Jamaica and Guyana and Trinidad and Barbados. Now, you also had what I call geopolitics. So Barbados was small and flat. They had a major rebellion there, but only one really, because there was nowhere for slaves to hide, and it was
because of the terrain of the land.
Terrain,
yeah,
the geography of it. As we know in Jamaica, you had Maroons. Guyana, they could run into the Amazon. And also Trinidad had, areas, mountainous areas where you could hide. So that the geography of those islands really defined who was able to truly rebel. But for the British trying to quell these rebellions, and they had their eye on what happened in Haiti, they knew that it was untenable. So they decided to play off the slave owners.
So in the play, the chief whip is Boyd,
Yeah.
but he's a man in the beginning who's fighting for the factory bill, isn't he?
Yeah.
And he has to be persuaded that actually he should put that to one side
Yeah.
because this is more important.
Yeah.
Why was it more important to the government to get through the abolition bill rather than the factory bill?
I think because the stakes were so high in terms of the British economy and the colonies, and they knew that it would have been too expensive, too many resources would have had to have been used to keep control of these colonies which were in gathering revolt. I think they felt that they could control a British population and one that they were trying to keep ignorant. What I also learned was that people working in the cotton mills were actually very aware of slavery in the colonies and in America. So you had a working class population who were becoming very radicalised about the oppression of others. Mm-hmm. So there was a real effort to suppress and control, but wisely, actually. So it didn't come as a result, as we're often taught, that this was about decency. It was a cold decision made because they knew that they could not control those colonies and they were terrified of what happened in Haiti.
So it's enlightened self-interest, really.
Yes, absolutely.
So in the play, you have Boyd pushing through the bill, and there are various MPs in opposition, and he's having to forge various allegiances with even more sort of hardcore anti-slavery, pro-abolition MPs. But there are also two key black characters, formerly enslaved. There's Edmund, who works for Boyd, and then there's Mercy, who has a kind of great testimony, and she's going to be used, isn't she, to go on the road and to explore the ignorance of people by telling them her story.
Yeah. So Mercy is very much fashioned around there was a a pre-suffragette, if you like, a lot of female activists, working class, from Mary Wollstonecraft. Because when Mary Prince arrived in this country, she very quickly was able to join with, feminist movements, women who were very much against slavery and very much for abolition. And again, that history isn't particularly well known. Mercy represents Mary Prince, who was speaking to politicians, and in the whip, she has to educate Boyd and lobby Boyd to prosecute, if you like, this abolition bill. But what really upsets her is the clause about apprenticeships, and she's trying to warn him that abolition must mean freedom, and that apprenticeship, you can't have a circumstance where freed slaves then become apprentices without the protection, if you like, of self-interested slave owners. Because if you own a car, you're going to take it for its MOT, you're going to make sure that car doesn't break down, and all the rest of it. If you're an apprentice, there is no the slave owner doesn't really have to feed and clothe you and look after you in the same way that he might have done a slave. So her concern was that, if they were made apprenticeships, it would be even worse. It would be a purgatory. She's there lobbying Boyd, and then she intersects with Horatia, who has literally run away from the north. She's tried to find freedom away from the cotton mills.
It's a white working class woman.
Yes, where her daughter has died. And those two women form an allegiance. But it's a hard-fought one because they have to learn to understand themselves. Horatia has to learn about Mercy, her experience on plantations as a slave. Horatia doesn't really know about that. What Horatia knows about is the abject conditions in the cotton mills where her daughter died. So she is learning that it's not just slavery in cotton mills, but it's slavery in colonies. And then Mercy must also learn about the abject conditions in cotton mills. So they do form a unit, and they undo the men, which is a lot of fun.
What's intriguing to me, I know a little bit about this period, is the degree there were so many black people in Britain at the time.
Yeah.
It's sometimes been said there were up to 10,000
Yeah.
black people in England in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. And I know about Ignatius Sancho,
Yeah.
who was self-educated, but came under the kind care and consideration of the Duke of Montagu.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book, a collection of letters, the Letters of Ignatius Sancho. And there's a famous abolitionist, enslaved man called Equiano. Who did you have in mind when you created Edmund?
Right. So I was very interested in the relationship between Samuel Johnson and Francis Barber. So Samuel Johnson, who was famous for conceiving the British dictionary, raised a young slave, if you like, as his son in his home. They were very much like
Francis
father.
Barber. Yeah.
That's right, Francis Barber. They were very much like father and son. And in fact, he bequeathed his, the things that he had earned through his life to Francis. So it was a very unusual relationship. It wasn't that what people would have considered a typical relationship at that time between a senior white academic and a young black man. So I fashioned the relationship between Alexander Boyd, the chief whip, and my character Edmund, and that Boyd had brought Edmund into his household because Boyd was very much against slavery, and he wanted to give Edmund, this runaway slave, an opportunity. And a bit like My Fair Lady, if you like, for him it was an experiment in many ways. What would become of Edmund if I can give him equal opportunity, an education and a home? Because he recognised him as intelligent, and he also liked him. He didn't have children. He raised him as a son. He made his library available to Edmund. But Edmund also worked for Boyd as a secretary, as a personal secretary.
He got some kudos from that.
Yes.
I imagine. Can we talk a little bit about the language? What was your approach to the language and the kind of authenticity of the time?
So that was really fascinating. I spent a lot of time in the House of Commons Library. I read Hansard from 1833 to 1834, and I also read committee reports about that, which were based on interviews with slave owners and their views about whether a black man could manage money, whether he could truly manage himself. The fascinating comparisons with Scottish peasantry, can a black man manage himself because Scottish peasants can't and they drink too much? Will we have the same problem that we have with our Scottish indentured labourers? The prejudice against the Irish and the Scottish, and the way that the elite use those parallels against the Negro slave absolutely fascinated me. But the language and the worldview was glorious. And I was able to replicate that because having read Hansard, creating those characters and the way that they express themselves really wasn't a problem. But I had to do that because I had to be in their shoes to truly understand how they express themselves. And the vulnerabilities they felt about diversity, giving up space to people who had been oppressed. And certainly that there were MPs who were willing to share that and others who weren't.
Now this play, 2020?
Yes.
And it had a nice run, and then bloody COVID comes into... Yeah. So how did that impact the play?
So we lost the last week.
Oh, just 1 week, was it? Okay.
Yeah, but there was a theatre in New York and a theatre in Washington, DC, which were interested. They asked for the rehearsal draft, and the idea was that it was going to go across the Atlantic, and it never did because of that.
Will this play have an afterlife?
There's a lot of interest, so I hope it will get into the West End at some stage. Yeah. I know that the Slavery Museum in Liverpool would like to do an on-site production or reading of it. And that is the only museum in the world dedicated to the transatlantic history. There are other museums in the world which have exhibitions about transatlantic slave trade, but this is the only one dedicated to. So a huge interest. I mean, I was interviewed on Radio 4, Radio 5 Live by presenters who were open-mouthed about that compensation bill and that we finished paying for that loan in 2015. And that you and I, Colin, as descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, our tax monies went into paying that off. Yeah. It's stunning.
Now, it's a very emotional story that you've told, and I've only read it, I haven't seen it sadly, but I found it quite emotional to reading. And I wonder how you feel about it, whether you find it emotionally traumatic to have even written it, never mind to experience it as a reader.
For me, it was a relief. I remember writing it and fearing that it would never see the light of day. Because the way that theatre operates, it's one thing to get a commission. You have to write a draft, then there's a certain amount of development, then you redraft, and then there has to be agreement to produce. That agreement to produce isn't always agreed. So there are a lot of writers who are commissioned and their work never sees the light of day. I had a lot of anxiety over my need to tell the story. So I didn't find it... The only thing that traumatised me was the idea that it would not be seen. That it would not be good enough to make the stage like the Swan. That it wouldn't get reviewed. And that it wouldn't travel. And that people would never get to hear the story. Because what I do know about the power of theatre, more so than a news bulletin, these things live. Storytelling is the birth of consciousness. We have to hang on to this. Culture, writers, one of my favourite quotes by Albert Camus, writers are there to stop civilization from destroying itself. If we don't enter these spaces and tell these stories, we can't influence and impact our histories and our futures. So for me, that was the biggest driver. I was amazed that no one else kind of wrote a screenplay or a stage play following the release of that tweet. So for me, I was working against the clock. It was ensuring that I could deliver work that the RSC would get behind and put on. And I remember the artistic director at the time saying to me that, it was for him, it was the real icing on the cake to be able to, get that on and see it properly produced and get a great cast behind it. The RSC were 100% supportive of me trying to tell the story because they felt that it intersected with a slice of history that just wasn't known at all. So yeah, I didn't find the past. I think it's because, and particularly because I've travelled around Latin America and the Caribbean, really trying to dig down and delve into the African diaspora, understanding where I fit into that, understanding that I am a descendant of this transatlantic slave trade, but finding pride in that. I don't, because I am sitting here breathing because of the courage and the resilience of people who survived it. So for me, it is a powerfully positive thing, but the possibility of it not seeing the light of day was more worrying for me.
Well, it just brings me back to that wonderful phrase, Marcus Garvey, people without a history is like a tree without a root.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
You've helped tease out the roots of our history, so thank you very much. All power to you. It's been really lovely talking to you.
Oh.
And nice to reconnect with you after all these years.
Absolutely.
Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.
I was talking to the playwright Juliet Gilkes Romero. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.